The black SUVs pulled up to the Riverside Public Library at exactly 2:47 p.m. on a Tuesday afternoon that would change everything. Captain Jake Morrison stepped out of the lead vehicle, his tactical boots silent on the cracked pavement as he surveyed the modest brick building before him. Behind him, 3 other operators emerged, each one a specialist, each one handpicked for this mission. Their target wasn't a terrorist or a war criminal. Their target was checking out romance novels and helping elderly patrons navigate the computer catalog. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Are you absolutely certain she's in there? Morrison spoke into his earpiece, his steel-gray eyes never leaving the library's front entrance. Confirmed, sir, came the voice of Intelligence Analyst Rebecca Torres from their command center 3 states away. Facial recognition got a hit yesterday. It's definitely her. Vivian Cross is alive, and she's been hiding in plain sight for 8 years. Morrison felt his jaw tighten. 8 years. 8 years they'd been searching for the woman who'd vanished without a trace after Operation Nightfall, the most classified mission in Special Operations history. The woman who'd single-handedly eliminated an entire terrorist cell in Montenegro while her team was pinned down. The woman who'd been declared Kia when her safe house exploded, though they never found a body. Through the library's large windows, Morrison could see her now. Shoulder-length auburn hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, reading glasses perched on her nose, wearing a soft lavender cardigan that made her look like someone's favorite aunt. She was helping a young mother find picture books for her toddler, her movements gentle and patient. Nothing about Vivian Cross suggested she was one of the deadliest operatives who'd ever served in the Shadow Division, but Morrison knew better. He'd studied her file until he'd memorized every mission, every confirmed kill, every impossible extraction she'd pulled off. The woman arranging children's books had once infiltrated a Serbian warlord's compound disguised as a translator and eliminated 17 guards without raising an alarm. The same hands now delicately turning pages had once assembled explosives that brought down a 3-story safe house in under 90 seconds. Visual confirmation established, Morrison murmured. Into his calm, beginning approach, his team moved with practiced precision. Operative Anya Kozlov positioned herself at the library's rear exit. The former Spetsnaz sniper could drop a target at 800 meters, but today her job was simply to ensure their ghost didn't vanish again. Tech specialist David Kim slipped around to monitor the building's security systems, his fingers already dancing across his tablet to loop the camera feeds. Sergeant Miguel Santos took position at the side entrance, his background in urban warfare, making him perfect for crowd control if this went sideways. Morrison had run scenarios for this moment dozens of times, but now that it was happening, he felt an unexpected weight in his chest. According to her file, Vivian Cross had been 28 when she disappeared. A prodigy recruited straight from MIT's engineering program, she'd shown an aptitude for covert operations that defied explanation. Her psychological profile indicated someone driven by a need to serve, to protect, to make a difference in the world's darkest corners. So why had she abandoned everything to become a small-town librarian? The mission briefing had been classified at the highest levels. Only Morrison and his team knew why they were here, why they needed to bring Vivian Cross back into the fold. The situation brewing in Eastern Europe required someone with her specific skill set, someone who could blend in, think 3 steps ahead, and eliminate threats with surgical precision. Someone who'd done it before. But as Morrison watched her kneel down to the toddler's eye level, showing the child how to sound out words in a picture book, he wondered if the woman they'd come to recruit even existed anymore. Had 8 years of quiet library life erased the lethal operative she'd once been? Or was she simply the most successful deep-cover agent in intelligence history? The library's automatic doors slid open with a soft whoosh as Morrison stepped inside. The familiar smell of old books and fresh coffee hit him immediately, a stark contrast to the sterile briefing rooms and tactical facilities he was used to. A few patrons looked up briefly, an elderly man reading newspapers, two college students hunched over laptops, a teenage girl doing homework at a corner table. None of them had any idea they were about to witness a moment that would ripple through the highest levels of government. Vivian Cross, or rather, the woman who now went by Victoria Summers, according to her library name, tag stood 20 feet away at the children's section. She was completely absorbed in her interaction with the young mother and child, her voice warm and encouraging as she recommended age-appropriate books. There was nothing calculated about her movements, no hint of the hypervigilance that marked career operators. She seemed genuinely, completely civilian. Morrison's earpiece crackled. "Sir, we've got movement. 2 more vehicles approaching from the east. They're not ours." His blood went cold. If they'd found Vivian Cross, others might have too. The people who'd wanted her dead 8 years ago, the ones responsible for bombing her safe house in Montenegro, might have finally tracked her down. "All units, maintain position," Morrison ordered quietly, his hand instinctively moving toward his concealed sidearm. "We proceed as planned, but stay alert." He took a deep breath and began walking toward the children's section, each step bringing him closer to the woman who'd haunted intelligence reports for nearly a decade. As he approached, Vivian looked up from the picture book she was holding. And for just a moment less than a heartbeat, Morrison saw something flicker in her eyes. A recognition, an assessment, a sudden sharpening of focus that lasted only an instant before the gentle librarian mask slipped back into place. She knew. Somehow, despite his civilian clothes and careful approach, she knew exactly who he was and why he was there. "Can I help you find something?" Vivian asked, her voice maintaining the same warm, helpful tone she'd used with the mother and child. But Morrison caught the subtle shift in her posture, the way her weight had moved to the balls of her feet, the almost imperceptible tensing of muscles that suggested she was ready to move. They had just walked into the library of the wrong librarian, and Morrison was beginning to suspect that after 8 years of searching for Vivian Cross, she had been waiting for them to find her all along. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I wonder where you're watching this unfold from today. Whether you're in a bustling metropolis like Chicago or a quiet mountain town in Colorado, perhaps you're viewing this from your local library, or maybe you're scrolling on your phone during a lunch break in downtown Seattle. Wherever you are in this vast country of ours, I'm certain you've walked past someone whose story would absolutely shock you if you knew the truth. Think about it for a moment. The friendly barista who makes your morning coffee with that perfect foam art. What if I told you she once defused bombs in Afghanistan? The gentle school crossing guard who waves at children every morning. What if he was a former Navy SEAL who completed classified missions you'll never read about in any newspaper? The quiet woman at your local DMV who processes your registration renewal with infinite patience. What if she once coordinated international rescue operations that saved hundreds of lives? We live in a world of hidden chapters, don't we? Every day we encounter people whose past lives would read like thriller novels, yet they've chosen the beautiful anonymity of ordinary existence. The grocery store clerk, the bank teller, the person sitting next to you on the subway, any one of them, could be carrying secrets that would rewrite everything you think you know about heroism and service. But here's what makes this particular story so extraordinary. Most of the time, these hidden warriors choose their quiet lives and never look back. They've earned their peace, their right to normalcy, their escape from a world of danger and impossible decisions. They've traded tactical gear for cardigans, briefing rooms for book clubs, and classified missions for mundane Tuesday afternoons. So, what happens when that choice gets taken away? What happens when the very skills you've tried to bury become the only thing standing between innocent people and unthinkable danger? What happens when the world that trained you, that shaped you into a weapon, comes knocking on your library door and reminds you that some debts to your country never truly get paid in full? From the sunny beaches of California to the snowy peaks of Vermont, from the plains of Kansas to the forests of Oregon, there are men and women living among us who carry the weight of classified heroism. They're your neighbors, your co-workers, the person ahead of you in line at the post office. They've seen things that would give you nightmares, done things that saved lives you'll never know about, and made sacrifices that history books will never record. Most of them want nothing more than to fade into the background, to let their warrior days become distant memories while they embrace the simple joy of helping a child find the perfect book, or showing an elderly patron how to send an email to their grandchildren. They've earned that peace through blood, sweat, and sleepless nights in places most of us couldn't pronounce, let alone find on a map. But sometimes, just sometimes, the world isn't quite finished with them yet. You see, what you're about to witness isn't just a story about a librarian and some government agents. It's a story about the impossible choice between the life you've built and the life that built you. It's about what happens when the person you used to be collides with the person you've become. It's about discovering that no matter how far you run from your past, there are some skills, some responsibilities, some calls to service that echo across years and continents until they find you again. Whether you're watching this from a coffee shop in Portland, a college dorm in Austin, or your living room in suburban Ohio, you're about to see something that happens more often than you might think. You're about to witness the moment when someone's carefully constructed new life gets shattered by the unavoidable truth of who they really are underneath it all. And here's the question that might keep you up tonight. If you had been trained to do impossible things, if you had served your country in ways that required you to become someone most people couldn't even imagine being, would you be able to truly walk away? Or would part of you always be listening for that knock on the door, that call back to a world where your unique skills mean the difference between success and catastrophe? Because in small towns and big cities across America, there are people who know the answer to that question. People who chose love over duty, peace over purpose, anonymity over recognition. People who thought they had successfully buried their former selves so deep that no one would ever find them again. People like Victoria Summers, who just realized that 8 years of helping patrons find the perfect book was about to end, because Captain Jake Morrison and his team hadn't come to the Riverside Public Library to check out anything other than the most dangerous woman most people had never heard of. What happens next will remind you that sometimes the most extraordinary people are hiding in the most ordinary places, and that the skills we think we've left behind have a way of choosing when they want to resurface. Victoria Summers had always been the kind of person who arrived at work 15 minutes early and left exactly on time. At 41, she possessed the sort of understated presence that made patrons feel immediately comfortable, soft-spoken, but knowledgeable, patient with the most demanding requests, and blessed with an almost supernatural ability to locate any book in the Riverside Public Library's sprawling collection. Her daily routine was as predictable as clockwork. Every morning at 7:45 a.m., she would unlock the heavy oak doors of the century-old library, disable the alarm system with practiced efficiency, and begin her opening checklist. First, she'd brew a pot of coffee in the small staff kitchen, the rich aroma filling the quiet spaces between towering bookshelves. Then she'd check the overnight book drop, sorting returns with meticulous care, her fingers moving across spines and due date cards with the precision of someone who genuinely loved organizing information. Victoria lived alone in a modest 2-story colonial house on Maple Street, just 4 blocks from the library. The house, built in 1952, featured sage green shutters and a wraparound porch where she spent summer evenings reading novels and sipping chamomile tea. Her neighbors, the elderly Hendersons next door and the young Martinez family across the street, knew her as the quiet woman who always brought homemade cookies to block parties and never missed her Tuesday evening book club meetings at the community center. The interior of her home reflected her personality perfectly, or at least, the personality she'd cultivated over the past 8 years. Built-in bookshelves lined every wall, filled with carefully curated collections of classic literature, contemporary fiction, and an impressive array of gardening guides. Fresh flowers from her backyard garden adorned the kitchen table year-round, and hand-knitted Afghans draped across well-worn furniture created an atmosphere of warmth and tranquility. Her co-workers at the library had Librarian Margaret Thornfield, children's specialist Rebecca Park, and part-time assistant Timothy Walsh considered Victoria the backbone of their small but dedicated team. She possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of the Dewey Decimal System and could recommend the perfect book for any patron's taste or reading level. During story time, children gravitated toward her gentle voice and animated expressions as she brought picture books to life. Teenagers trusted her with their research projects, knowing she'd guide them to credible sources without judgment about their procrastination. What struck everyone who knew Victoria was her remarkable composure under pressure. When the library's ancient heating system failed during a February blizzard, she calmly organized space heaters and hot chocolate for stranded patrons. When an agitated patron became verbally abusive about overdue fines, Victoria diffused the situation with such skill that the man ended up apologizing and signing up for the library's literacy volunteer program. She possessed an almost uncanny ability to read people, to sense their needs before they voiced them, to make everyone feel heard and valued. Her personal habits reinforced this image of steady reliability. Victoria shopped for groceries every Saturday morning at Millbrook Market, always greeting cashier Linda Chun with genuine warmth and inquiring about her college studies. She attended St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church most Sundays, sitting in the same pew 4th row, left side, and contributing quietly to the congregation's food drives and community outreach programs. Her car, a sensible silver Honda Civic with 127,000 miles, was always clean and well-maintained, parked in the same spot behind the library every workday. Victoria's social life centered around her book club, where 8 local women gathered monthly to discuss everything from classic literature to contemporary bestsellers. She was known for asking thoughtful questions that deepened their discussions, and for bringing elaborate cheese platters that everyone raved about. Her closest friend in the group, Sarah Wellington, often marveled at Victoria's ability to remember every patron's reading preferences and family details. "She has the most incredible memory," Sarah would tell people. Victoria remembers that Mrs. Patterson's grandson is deployed overseas, so she always sets aside military memoirs for her. She knows that teenage Jake Morrison is struggling with his parents' divorce, so she quietly recommends books about resilience and coping. She sees people, really sees them, in a way that's rare these days. This attention to detail extended to every aspect of Victoria's work. She maintained detailed files on regular patrons' interests, created personalized reading lists for struggling students, and somehow always knew exactly which book would provide comfort during difficult times. Her desk in the library's administrative office was organized with military precision color-coded filing systems, labeled containers for every supply, and a calendar marked with library events, book deliveries, and community programs. Victoria's wardrobe reflected her practical, unpretentious nature. Cardigans in soft pastels, comfortable slacks, sensible flats, and reading glasses on a delicate chain. She favored earth tones and classic cuts that never went out of style, choosing quality over trendiness in everything from her leather handbag to her simple gold watch. a gift to herself on her 40th birthday. Her makeup was minimal but expertly applied, enhancing her natural features without drawing attention. The community respected Victoria's boundaries as much as they appreciated her service. She deflected personal questions with gentle humor, redirecting conversations toward books, local events, or the other person's interests. When pressed about her past, she'd smile and mention working in government consulting before moving on to safer topics. Her references to previous experience were always vague. I used to travel quite a bit for work, or I dealt with stressful situations in my former career, but delivered with such naturalness that no one thought to probe deeper. Victoria had created the perfect life for someone who wanted to disappear completely. She was visible enough to avoid suspicion, but unremarkable enough to fade into the background of small-town life. She contributed just enough to the community to be valued, but never enough to draw significant attention. She was helpful without being intrusive, knowledgeable without being pretentious, friendly without being overly personal. Her home office, tucked away in the upstairs bedroom she'd converted into a reading room, contained the only hints of her intellectual depth. Advanced texts on international relations, translated works of philosophy, and several books on linguistics sat alongside her fiction collection. A world map covered one wall, marked with small pins and locations that seemed random to any casual observer. A locked filing cabinet held what appeared to be financial documents and tax records, though anyone who looked closely might wonder why a small-town librarian needed such an elaborate security system for storing paperwork. But even these subtle indicators revealed nothing of the truth. Victoria Summers had constructed her identity so carefully, so completely, that she'd almost convinced herself it was real. Almost convinced herself that the woman who could disassemble a rifle in under 60 seconds had never existed. Almost convinced herself that the nightmares that sometimes woke her at 3 a.m. were just products of an overactive imagination, not memories of missions that officially never happened. For 8 years, this carefully crafted existence had been enough. Victoria had found genuine satisfaction in helping others, real peace in her quiet routines, and something approaching happiness in her simple, honest life. But as Captain Jake Morrison approached her position in the children's section, Victoria realized with crystal clarity that her 8-year experiment in normalcy was about to end, and the woman she'd worked so hard to bury was about to be forcibly resurrected. What the residents of Riverside didn't know, what Captain Morrison's files could only hint at, was that Victoria Summers had once been the most lethal operative in the Shadow Division's 20-year history. Born Vivian Alexandra Cross in Detroit, to an aerospace engineer father and a linguistics professor mother, she had demonstrated an extraordinary combination of intellectual brilliance and physical capability from an early age. At MIT, where she enrolled at 17 with a full scholarship, Vivian had double majored in electrical engineering and international relations while secretly training in 7 different martial arts disciplines. Her professors remembered her as the student who could solve complex algorithms in her head while simultaneously translating technical documents between English, Russian, Mandarin, and Arabic. What they didn't know was that she spent her summers at classified training facilities, recruited by a Shadow Division talent scout who'd been monitoring her academic performance and psychological evaluations. The Shadow Division operated in the spaces between official government agencies, too sensitive for the CIA, too complex for special forces, too dangerous for anyone except the most exceptional individuals. Their operatives didn't exist in any database, didn't receive recognition or medals, and certainly didn't retire with pensions and thank you letters from grateful presidents. They were ghosts who solved problems that officially never existed, in places that didn't appear on any map, against enemies whose names were never spoken aloud in congressional hearings. Vivian's recruitment had been subtle, elegant, and absolutely inevitable. Dr. Amanda Reeves, her international relations professor, had assigned a seemingly routine research project on unconventional warfare tactics. Vivian's analysis had been so sophisticated, so strategically brilliant, that it had been forwarded directly to Deputy Director Harrison Vale at Shadow Division headquarters. Within 6 months, Vivian was spending her winter break at a facility in Montana that didn't officially exist, learning skills that universities definitely didn't teach. Her training had been unlike anything in conventional military programs. Shadow Division operatives weren't soldiers in the traditional sense. They were chameleons, capable of becoming anyone, anywhere, at any time. Vivian learned to kill silently with everything from piano wire to improvised explosives made from household chemicals. She mastered the art of social engineering, becoming so adept at reading people and manipulating conversations that she could extract classified information from targets who never realized they'd been compromised. But Vivian's true genius lay in her ability to disappear completely into any identity. She could become a Russian arms dealer's mistress, gathering intelligence while planning his elimination. She could pose as a Pakistani journalist, infiltrating terrorist cells while feeding information back to strike teams. She could transform into a Serbian translator, walking into heavily guarded compounds and walking out after neutralizing every threat without raising a single alarm. Her first official mission had taken place during her senior year at MIT, while her classmates were writing thesis papers and interviewing for corporate positions. Vivian was infiltrating a human trafficking network that spanned 3 continents. She spent 4 months as Anna Petrov, a desperate Russian woman seeking passage to America. By the time Shadow Division Strike Team Alpha moved in to shut down the operation, Vivian had identified every major player, mapped their financial networks, and eliminated the 3 most dangerous operators with such skill that their deaths appeared to be accidents. The Montenegro operation remained classified at levels so high that even most Shadow Division personnel had never heard of it. An arms dealer named Dmitry Kozlovsky had been selling chemical weapons to terrorist organizations while maintaining diplomatic immunity through his connections to the Serbian government. Traditional diplomatic pressure had failed. Economic sanctions had been circumvented. Even targeted cyber attacks had proven ineffective against his old school analog security systems. So they sent Vivian. She spent 3 months becoming Katerina Volkov, a brilliant chemist with a mysterious past and flexible morals. Kozlovsky, notorious for his appreciation of beautiful and dangerous women, had been utterly captivated by her combination of intellectual brilliance and calculated vulnerability. She'd convinced him that she was fleeing prosecution in Russia for selling state secrets, that she needed his protection and was willing to pay for it. With her expertise in chemical warfare, the operation required her to live in Kozlovsky's compound for 6 weeks, sharing his bed while cataloging every security measure, every personnel rotation, every weakness in his seemingly impenetrable fortress. She learned the names of his clients, the locations of his weapons caches, the details of planned attacks that would have killed thousands of innocent people across Europe and North America. On the night of the final phase, everything went wrong. Kozlovsky received intelligence that suggested Katerina might not be who she claimed to be. Instead of confronting her directly, he decided to test her loyalty by ordering her to personally deliver a chemical weapon to a terrorist cell in Bosnia. The mission was designed to be a one-way trip. If she was truly committed to his cause, she would die completing it. If she was a spy, she would either refuse or try to escape. Confirming his suspicions, Vivian had 13 minutes to make a choice that would define the rest of her life. She could abort the mission, call for extraction, and let Kozlovsky escape with enough chemical weapons to devastate multiple cities. Or she could complete the operation alone, knowing that her chances of survival were less than 20%. She chose the mission. What happened in the next 4 hours became the stuff of legend within Shadow Division circles. Vivian eliminated 17 guards, disabled 3 separate security systems, planted explosives throughout the compound's chemical storage facility, and extracted intelligence on 12 different terrorist networks. She managed to upload terabytes of data to Shadow Division servers while simultaneously coordinating with strike teams to intercept weapon shipments across 3 time zones. The compound explosion was visible from space. Kozlovsky's entire organization was dismantled in a single night. The chemical weapons were safely destroyed. The terrorist networks were rolled up by international law enforcement, and dozens of planned attacks were prevented. But the explosion that was supposed to cover Vivian's escape instead trapped her in the compound's underground tunnels. For 36 hours, Shadow Division believed their most valuable operative had been killed in action. Her handler, Director Patricia Wells, personally flew to Montenegro to oversee the search for any recoverable remains. They never found a body. Because Vivian had done something unprecedented in Shadow Division history, she had chosen to disappear rather than report in. The explosion had provided perfect cover for her own death, and she had seized the opportunity to simply cease existing as Vivian Cross, the woman who walked away from the smoking ruins of Kozlovsky's compound. Was no longer a Shadow Division operative. She was a ghost with 8 years of false identities, buried bank accounts, and contingency plans. For 3 years, she had moved through a carefully planned sequence of temporary identities across Eastern Europe, slowly making her way back to the United States while Shadow Division searched for their missing agent. When she finally arrived in Riverside 8 years ago, she had enough documentation to become Victoria Summers permanently, enough money to live modestly indefinitely, and enough skills to disappear forever if anyone ever came looking for Vivian Cross. She had chosen peace over duty, anonymity over recognition, and the simple pleasure of helping children find books over the complex satisfaction of eliminating threats to national security. For 8 years, she had convinced herself that this choice was permanent, that the woman who could kill 17 trained soldiers without making a sound had been buried as completely as Kozlovsky's compound. But as Captain Morrison's footsteps approached across the library's worn carpet, Vivian realized that some choices aren't permanent, some skills never truly disappear, and some debts to your country follow. No matter how far you run or how completely you try to reinvent yourself, the most dangerous woman most people had never heard of was about to be reminded that retirement from the Shadow Division had never actually been an option. The decision to disappear from the Shadow Division hadn't been born from cowardice or disillusionment. It had been born from a promise made to a dying woman in a bombed-out hospital in Sarajevo. 3 months before the Montenegro operation that would change everything. Dr. Elena Vasquez had been Vivian's handler, mentor, and the closest thing to a mother she'd known since her own parents died in a car accident during her sophomore year. At MIT, Elena had been the one to recruit Vivian, to see the potential in a brilliant but grief-stricken young woman who channeled her pain into an almost superhuman dedication to protecting others. For 7 years, Elena had guided Vivian through increasingly dangerous missions, teaching her not just how to kill efficiently, but how to carry the weight of necessary violence without losing her humanity. Elena had been the architect of Vivian's psychological resilience, the woman who taught her that emotions weren't weaknesses to be suppressed, but tools to be understood and channeled. The moment you stop feeling the weight of what we do, Elena had told her during their first training session, is the moment you become as dangerous to innocent people as the threats we eliminate. The Sarajevo mission was supposed to be routine. Intelligence gathering, Elena posing as a Red Cross coordinator while Vivian infiltrated a suspected weapons smuggling operation disguised as humanitarian aid. They had worked together dozens of times before, their partnership so seamless that other Shadow Division operatives called them the Mirror Team for their ability to anticipate each other's thoughts and actions. But intelligence had been wrong about the level of security. What should have been a simple surveillance operation turned into a firefight that left Elena critically wounded, and Vivian trapped in a collapsing building with enemy combatants closing in from 3 directions. Vivian could have escaped her training. Instincts screamed at her to cut her losses and extract to the predetermined rally point. Instead, she chose to carry Elena through 2 miles of urban warfare to the nearest functioning medical facility. For 6 days, Vivian maintained her cover as Anna Kozlov, a Russian journalist, while Elena fought for her life in the intensive care unit of Sarajevo General Hospital. During the day, she conducted interviews and filed reports to maintain her journalistic cover. During the night, she sat beside Elena's bed, watching machines breathe for the woman who had shaped her into the most effective operative in Shadow Division history. On the 6th night, Elena regained consciousness long enough for one final conversation that would haunt Vivian for the rest of her life. "I never had children," Elena whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of medical equipment. "Never had a normal life, never had Sunday dinners with family or birthday parties, or simple conversations about ordinary things. I told myself the work was enough, that saving strangers was more important than personal happiness." Vivian held Elena's hand, feeling the tremor in fingers that had once been steady enough to perform microsurgery on explosive devices. "You saved thousands of lives. The work you did, the work never ends, Mia," Elena interrupted, using the Spanish endearment she'd adopted for Vivian years earlier. "There's always another threat, another mission, another reason why you can't step away. And one day you wake up and realize you've spent your entire life being someone else, and you can't remember who you were supposed to be underneath all the false identities." Elena's grip tightened with surprising strength. "Promise me something. Promise me that when you find a chance to be yourself, really yourself, you'll take it. Don't let them convince you that the work is more important than your life. Don't make my mistake." 12 hours later, Elena died from complications related to internal bleeding. Her official cause of death listed as injuries sustained in a terrorist attack on humanitarian workers. Her real identity, her decades of service, her role in preventing countless tragedies, none of it appeared in any obituary or official record. She was buried in a Shadow Division cemetery that didn't appear on any map, mourned by operatives whose names were classified, honored by a government that couldn't acknowledge her existence. Vivian returned to Montenegro 3 weeks later for what would become her final mission, Elena's words echoing in her mind with every breath. As she prepared to infiltrate Kozlovsky's organization, she realized that Elena had been right about the endless nature of their work. Eliminating Kozlovsky would prevent immediate disasters, but there would always be another arms dealer, another terrorist network, another threat requiring her unique skills. The promise she'd made to Elena became her secret exit strategy. When the compound exploded and Shadow Division assumed she was dead, Vivian saw it as Elena's final gift, a chance to honor her mentor's dying wish by choosing life over duty, identity over mission, personal happiness over professional excellence. Leaving the Shadow Division meant more than abandoning a career. It meant severing connections to the only family she'd known since her parents' death. Her fellow operatives had been her siblings, her handlers, her parental figures, her missions, her purpose for existing. Walking away from that world meant accepting a profound loneliness that no amount of community involvement could fully heal. The transition to civilian life had been more difficult than any mission she'd ever completed. Victoria Summers had to learn how to form genuine relationships without ulterior motives, how to care about people without calculating their tactical value, how to live in the present without constantly scanning for threats. Simple pleasures, reading for enjoyment rather than intelligence gathering, cooking meals because she enjoyed the process rather than maintaining a cover identity required conscious effort to appreciate. She kept Elena's final letter in a safety deposit box at Riverside First National Bank, along with emergency documentation and enough cash to disappear again if necessary. The letter, written during Elena's final lucid moments and delivered to Vivian through Shadow Division's secure communication network, contained the coordinates to a small cabin in northern Canada where Elena had planned to retire someday, along with detailed instructions for accessing hidden accounts that could fund a lifetime of anonymity. "By the time you read this," Elena had written, "you'll have already made the choice to save me instead of completing the mission as ordered. That decision tells me everything I need to know about who you've become underneath all that training. You're still human, Mia. Don't let them take that away from you." The cabin had become Vivian's sanctuary during her first year as Victoria Summers. She'd spent 3 months there, learning how to sleep without weapons within reach, how to wake up without immediately assessing escape routes, how to exist without a mission briefing defining her daily purpose. Elena's book still lined the shelves, novels she'd planned to read, gardening guides for the vegetables she'd wanted to grow, photo albums documenting a secret life of simple pleasures stolen between assignments. It was in that cabin that Victoria had realized the full scope of Elena's sacrifice. Her mentor had spent decades pretending to be other people, and in the process, she'd lost track of who she was when she wasn't working. Victoria had vowed not to make the same mistake, to build a real identity rather than simply adopting another. Cover story. The 8 years in Riverside had been her attempt to honor that vow. Every genuine friendship, every book recommendation that brought joy to a patron, every quiet evening spent reading on her porch, all of it was proof that Elena's sacrifice had meaning, that it was possible to choose personal happiness over professional duty without losing the essential desire to help others. But as Captain Morrison closed the distance between them in the library's children's section, Victoria felt the weight of Elena's other warning: the work never truly ends. Somewhere in the world, a situation had developed that required her specific combination of skills and experience. Somewhere, innocent lives hung in the balance, and the government that had trained her to be the perfect weapon was calling in. The debt she thought she'd escaped, the choice between honoring Elena's memory and answering her country's call, was about to test everything Victoria had learned about herself during 8 years of civilian life. The question wasn't whether she could still access the lethal skills she'd worked so hard to bury, it was whether choosing to use them again would destroy the woman she'd fought so hard to become. Elena's voice echoed in her memory. "Don't let them convince you that the work is more important than your life." But what happened when the work involved protecting lives just as valuable as her own? Captain Jake Morrison represented everything that the new Shadow Division had become in the 8 years since Vivian Cross had vanished, younger, more aggressive, and dangerously convinced that the ends always justified the means. At 34, Morrison had climbed the ranks through a combination of tactical brilliance and ruthless pragmatism that older operatives found both impressive and deeply troubling. Unlike the careful, methodical approach that had defined Elena Vasquez's gene ration of handlers, Morrison believed in overwhelming force and acceptable collateral damage. Where Elena had spent months crafting elegant solutions that eliminated threats while protecting innocent bystanders, Morrison preferred shock-and-awe operations that prioritized speed and certainty over subtlety and surgical precision. His rise through Shadow Division hierarchy had been meteoric. Recruited from Delta Force after a series of successful but controversial operations in Syria, Morrison had demonstrated an almost supernatural ability to locate and eliminate high-value targets. His methods were effective, his success rate unprecedented, and his willingness to cross lines that other operatives considered sacred made him invaluable for missions that required someone willing to make impossible choices. But Morrison's greatest strength was also his most dangerous weakness. He viewed every situation through the lens of tactical advantage rather than human cost. People weren't individuals with complex motivations and inherent worth. They were assets to be deployed, obstacles to be removed, or collateral damage to be minimized when possible but accepted when necessary. The current crisis that had brought him to Riverside perfectly exemplified his worldview. 3 weeks earlier, intelligence had identified Dr. Alexei Petrov, a former Soviet biochemist, preparing to sell weaponized anthrax to a consortium of terrorist organizations. The planned transaction would take place in Geneva in 72 hours, with enough biological weapon material to devastate multiple major cities across Europe and North America. Traditional shadow division protocol would have involved months of careful infiltration, building trust with Petrov's organization, identifying all members of the conspiracy, and dismantling the entire network while securing the weapons. But Morrison had convinced his superiors that they didn't have months. Petrov was suspicious, paranoid, and growing increasingly erratic. Any attempt at slow infiltration would likely spook him into accelerating the timeline or disappearing entirely. Morrison's solution was characteristically direct. Insert Vivian Cross into Petrov's inner circle using her established reputation in the international arms-dealing community. According to Shadow Division intelligence, Petrov had been one of Dmitry Kozlovsky's primary suppliers before the Montenegro operation. He would remember Katerina Volkov, the brilliant chemist who had been Kozlovsky's lover and trusted advisor. Before the compound explosion. The plan required Vivian to resurface as Katerina, convincing Petrov that she had survived the Montenegro disaster and spent 8 years in hiding, waiting for the right opportunity to return to the weapons trade. She would position herself as someone seeking revenge against the Shadow Division operatives who had destroyed her life, making her the perfect partner for someone planning attacks against Western targets. Morrison had spent weeks refining the operational details with the cold efficiency that had made him Shadow Division's youngest ever mission commander. Vivian would have 48 hours to establish contact with Petrov, gain his trust, identify the location of the biological weapons, and provide intelligence for a strike team to neutralize the threat. The timeline was impossibly tight, the margin for error non-existent, and the consequences of failure catastrophic. What Morrison failed to understand, what his generation of operatives consistently overlooked, was that people like Vivian Cross hadn't become legendary through brute force and tactical superiority. They had succeeded because they understood that every mission involved real human beings with complex motivations, personal histories, and unpredictable emotional responses. Elena's approach had been successful precisely because it acknowledged that enemies were people first and targets second. Morrison's briefing files on Vivian revealed both his analytical brilliance and his fundamental blindness to human nature. He had studied every available record of her missions, analyzed her tactical patterns, and calculated her effectiveness ratings with mathematical precision. He knew that she had eliminated 47 high-value targets across 6 continents, that her missions had prevented an estimated 12 major terrorist attacks, and that her cover identities had never been compromised through traditional intelligence gathering. But Morrison had no understanding of the psychological cost that this record represented, no appreciation for the emotional toll that maintaining multiple identities had taken on Vivian's sense of self. He saw her 8-year disappearance as a temporary retreat rather than a fundamental rejection of the Shadow Division lifestyle. In his mind, Vivian was simply an asset that had been temporarily offline, waiting to be reactivated when circumstances required her unique capabilities. Morrison's team reflected his leadership philosophy perfectly. Anya Kozlov, his sniper specialist, was a former Spetsnaz operative who had defected after her unit was disbanded following the Ukrainian conflict. She possessed exceptional marksmanship skills and zero emotional investment in American ideological principles. She worked for Morrison because he paid well and provided opportunities to use her talents. David Kim, his technology specialist, was a brilliant hacker who had been recruited directly from MIT after designing cybersecurity systems for the Pentagon. Miguel Santos, his urban warfare expert, had served 3 tours in Afghanistan before. being court-martialed for excessive use of force against civilian populations. Each member of Morrison's team was technically competent and tactically effective, but none of them possessed the deep understanding of human psychology that had made Elena's generation of operatives so successful at long-term infiltration and identity manipulation. They were warriors rather than spies, soldiers rather than chameleons, weapons rather than scalpels. Morrison's approach to locating Vivian exemplified this philosophical difference. Rather than spending months carefully investigating her potential civilian identities, he had simply fed her photograph through every facial recognition system available to Shadow Division. The technology had done in weeks what traditional investigation might have taken years to accomplish, but it had also announced their presence to anyone monitoring those same systems. More troubling was Morrison's fundamental misunderstanding of why Vivian had chosen to disappear. His psychological profile assumed that she had suffered some form of combat fatigue or post-traumatic stress that had temporarily compromised her effectiveness. He believed that 8 years of civilian life had been a form of extended therapy, that she had been essentially healing from the psychological damage of her Shadow Division service. Morrison couldn't conceive that someone might voluntarily abandon the Shadow Division, not because they were broken, but because they had discovered something more valuable than professional excellence. He couldn't understand that Vivian's choice to become Victoria Summers represented growth rather than retreat, fulfillment rather than escape, a conscious decision to prioritize personal authenticity over professional achievement. This blind spot made Morrison both more dangerous and more vulnerable than he realized. His confidence in his ability to simply reactivate Vivian stemmed from his belief that Shadow Division service was the highest possible calling, that anyone who had experienced the satisfaction of protecting national security would naturally want to return to that work when circumstances demanded it. But Morrison had never experienced the kind of personal relationships that Victoria had built in Riverside. He had never discovered the profound satisfaction of helping people without ulterior motives, of being valued for kindness rather than lethality, of waking up each morning without wondering whether today would require him to kill someone. As he approached Victoria's position in the children's section, Morrison carried with him not just the weight of a critical mission, but the absolute certainty that he was offering her a chance to return to her true calling. In his mind, he wasn't destroying her carefully constructed new life. He was rescuing her from 8 years of meaningless civilian existence and returning her to work that actually mattered. The collision between Morrison's worldview and Victoria's hard-won wisdom was about to test everything both of them believed about duty, sacrifice, and the true meaning of service to others. The conversation began with the kind of polite fiction that both Morrison and Victoria understood perfectly. He introduced himself as Agent Johnson from the State Department, claiming to be investigating irregularities in federal grant applications for small-town libraries. Victoria played along flawlessly. Her response is exactly what a helpful librarian would provide: detailed explanations of their funding sources, careful documentation of expenditures, and genuine enthusiasm for their literacy programs. But beneath the surface pleasantries, a complex psychological chess match was already underway. Morrison tested Victoria with seemingly innocent questions that probed for inconsistencies in her background. Victoria deflected with the practiced ease of someone who had spent 8 years perfecting the art of appearing completely ordinary while revealing absolutely nothing substantive about herself. Your personnel file indicates you moved here from the eastern part of the state, Morrison said, consulting a tablet that Victoria knew contained far more than library employment records. What brought you to Riverside specifically? I wanted a quieter pace of life, Victoria replied, her voice carrying just the right note of wistfulness. After my consulting work, I was ready for something more meaningful. Helping people find the information they need, watching children discover their love of reading. It's incredibly fulfilling. Morrison's questions grew more pointed over the following days. He returned twice that week, always with new bureaucratic concerns that required Victoria's assistance. His visits followed a pattern designed to establish baseline behaviors and identify potential stress responses. He asked about her previous work experience, her educational background, her reason for choosing library science as a career change. Each question was a probe, carefully constructed to elicit information that could either confirm or contradict Shadow Division intelligence about Vivian Cross. Morrison was looking for tells microexpressions, physiological responses, verbal patterns that might indicate deception or recognition. What he found instead was a woman so thoroughly committed to her cover identity that she had essentially become Victoria Summers at a cellular level. The psychological pressure intensified when Morrison began appearing at Victoria's regular haunts around Riverside. He showed up at Millbrook Market during her Saturday grocery shopping, positioning himself in the checkout line behind her and engaging in casual conversation about local produce prices. He attended the same Sunday service at St. Andrew's Presbyterian, sitting 3 pews behind her and observing her interactions with other congregation members. Most unsettling was his presence at the monthly book club meeting. Morrison arrived at the community center with a cover story about being new to town and interested in literary discussion groups. Sarah Wellington, ever the gracious hostess, welcomed him warmly and introduced him to the other members as Agent Johnson, who's been helping the library with some federal compliance issues. Throughout the evening, Morrison demonstrated an impressive knowledge of contemporary fiction and classic literature, contributing thoughtfully to their discussion of Margaret Atwood's latest novel while simultaneously studying Victoria's reactions and behavioral patterns. He noted how she deflected personal questions, how she guided conversations away from potentially sensitive topics, how she maintained perfect emotional control, even when discussing books that dealt with themes of violence, betrayal, and moral compromise. But Morrison's surveillance revealed something he hadn't expected. Victoria's relationships in Riverside were genuinely meaningful rather than merely functional. Her concern for elderly Mrs. Patterson's grandson wasn't performative. She actually remembered his deployment schedule and regularly selected books she thought might comfort his worried grandmother. Her mentorship of teenage Jake Morrison wasn't strategic positioning. She genuinely cared about helping a troubled young man find stability after his parents' divorce. This discovery prompted Morrison to escalate his approach. If Victoria had truly integrated herself into the community, then the community itself could become leverage for securing her cooperation. Morrison began what he privately called environmental pressure, subtle disruptions designed to create stress and uncertainty in Victoria's carefully ordered world. The first incident occurred when Victoria arrived at work to find that the library's computer system had suffered what appeared to be a random cyber attack. All patron records, circulation, data, and digital catalog information had been corrupted overnight. David Kim had designed the attack to look like standard ransomware, but its true purpose was to observe how Victoria responded to crisis situations and whether she demonstrated any technical capabilities beyond basic library science skills. Victoria's response was exactly what a competent librarian would do. She contacted local IT support, implemented manual backup procedures, and worked overtime to maintain library services while the systems were restored. But Morrison noticed subtle details that suggested more sophisticated technical knowledge: how quickly she isolated affected systems to prevent further damage, how efficiently she prioritized data recovery, how calmly she managed both staff and patron concerns during the crisis. The psychological pressure continued with a series of seemingly unrelated incidents. Victoria's car was vandalized in the library, parking lot. Minor damage that looked like random mischief but occurred on 3 separate occasions over 2 weeks. Her home security system malfunctioned repeatedly, triggering false alarms that brought police to her door at inconvenient hours. The library received anonymous complaints about Victoria's performance, forcing her to undergo administrative review and additional scrutiny from her supervisors. Each incident was designed to create cumulative stress while maintaining plausible deniability. Morrison was testing Victoria's breaking point, looking for the moment when her carefully maintained civilian facade would crack and reveal the operational instincts underneath. He expected to see signs of counter-surveillance, defensive preparations, or attempts to identify and neutralize the source of harassment. Instead, Victoria responded to each incident with the patience and resilience of someone who had genuinely embraced civilian life. She filed police reports when appropriate, contacted her insurance company about the car damage, and worked with security technicians to resolve the alarm malfunctions. Her responses were exactly what an innocent librarian would do, demonstrating either perfect cover discipline or complete authenticity. Morrison's frustration grew when his investigation into Victoria's background revealed layers of documentation so thorough and consistent that they either represented 8 years of meticulous cover maintenance or genuine civilian existence. Her tax records, medical history, employment evaluations, and community involvement all supported the Victoria Summers identity without any apparent inconsistencies. The turning point came when Morrison decided to test Victoria's physical capabilities. He arranged for Miguel Santos to stage a seemingly random mugging attempt in the library parking lot as Victoria left work one evening. The scenario was designed to look like opportunistic street crime while observing whether Victoria would respond with civilian panic or operational training. Miguel approached Victoria's car wearing a ski mask and demanding her purse. His movements, deliberately clumsy to avoid actually threatening someone who might genuinely be a civilian librarian. What happened next lasted less than 10 seconds, but confirmed every suspicion Morrison had harbored about Victoria's true identity. Victoria's initial response appeared perfectly normal. She raised her hands defensively and stepped backward toward the library entrance. But Morrison, watching through night vision scope from his concealed position, noticed micro movements that no civilian would make. How her weight shifted to her dominant foot. How her hands positioned themselves for defensive action rather than surrender. How her eyes tracked escape routes while maintaining apparent focus on the threat. Most telling was what she didn't do. Victoria didn't scream, didn't panic, didn't display any of the physiological responses that genuine civilians exhibited. When confronted with sudden violence, her breathing remained controlled, her posture maintained balance, and her awareness extended beyond the immediate threat to encompass potential backup attackers or escape routes. Miguel completed the scenario by grabbing Victoria's purse and fleeing on foot, but not before Morrison's surveillance equipment captured high-definition footage of Victoria's face during the encounter. The expression revealed in those few seconds, alert, calculating, dangerous, belonged to Vivian Cross, not Victoria Summers. Morrison finally had proof that 8 years of civilian life hadn't erased the lethal operative underneath. But he also realized that Victoria's integration into Riverside was deeper and more genuine than Shadow Division protocols had anticipated. She wasn't simply maintaining a cover identity, she had built a real life, formed authentic relationships, and discovered a version of herself that existed independent of Shadow Division training. This discovery complicated Morrison's mission significantly. Standard reactivation procedures assumed that dormant operatives would welcome return to active duty, that civilian life was temporary refuge rather than permanent choice. But Victoria's response pattern suggested someone who had genuinely moved beyond Shadow Division service, who might resist reactivation not from fear or incompetence, but from a conscious decision to protect the life she had built. Morrison realized that bringing Vivian Cross back into the fold would require destroying Victoria Summers completely, and that Victoria might fight just as hard to protect her civilian identity as she had once fought to complete Shadow Division missions. The breaking point came on a Thursday morning when Victoria arrived at the library to find Morrison waiting inside, no longer pretending to be Agent Johnson from the State Department. He stood in the main reading area wearing full tactical gear, his sidearm visible, flanked by Anya Kozlov and David Kim. The message was unmistakable. The time for polite fiction had ended. "Good morning, Vivian," Morrison said, using her real name for the first time. His voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to absolute compliance. "We need to talk." Victoria felt the familiar sensation of multiple realities colliding, the carefully constructed world of Victoria Summers meeting the lethal precision of Vivian Cross. For 8 years, she had successfully kept these identities separate, but Morrison's presence in her sanctuary forced them into direct confrontation. She noticed that he had positioned his team to control all exits while maintaining sight lines that would prevent civilian casualties if the situation escalated. "I'm afraid you have me confused with someone else," Victoria replied, her voice maintaining the gentle tone that library patrons had come to expect. But she moved with subtle efficiency, positioning herself behind the circulation desk where emergency protocols could be activated, where multiple escape routes remained available, where her knowledge of the building's layout provided tactical advantage. Morrison smiled with the confidence of someone holding overwhelming evidence. "Dr. Alexei Petrov has accelerated his timeline. The biological weapons transaction is happening tomorrow night in Geneva instead of 72 hours from now. We have 18 hours to get you briefed, equipped, and inserted into his operation as Katerina Volkov." The name hit Victoria like a physical blow. Katerina Volkov, the identity she had buried along with Dmitry Kozlovsky's compound 8 years ago. Morrison wasn't just asking her to return to Shadow Division service. He was demanding that she resurrect the most dangerous cover identity she had ever maintained, the one that had nearly cost her everything, the one she had promised Elena she would never use again. "I don't know what you're talking about," Victoria said, but her body language betrayed her words. Morrison caught the micro-tension in her shoulders, the slight shift in her stance that indicated combat readiness, the way her eyes assessed threat levels and escape routes with practiced efficiency. Morrison gestured to David Kim, who activated a tablet displaying classified footage from the Montenegro operation. The video showed Katerina Volkov Vivian Cross moving through Kozlovsky's compound with lethal grace, eliminating guards with surgical precision, planting explosives with the calm expertise of someone for whom violence was simply another tool, to be deployed when circumstances required it. "Petrov remembers Katerina," Morrison continued, his voice taking on the urgency of someone delivering a briefing under extreme time pressure. "He was Kozlovsky's primary supplier before you brought down the entire operation. He's paranoid, suspicious, and growing increasingly erratic, but he would trust Katerina Volkov. She's the only identity that can get close enough to identify the weapon's location and provide targeting data for our strike team." Victoria watched the footage with the detached professionalism of someone analyzing tactical operations, but internally she felt the careful boundaries of her civilian life beginning to crumble. The woman on screen moved with deadly efficiency that Victoria had spent 8 years trying to forget, demonstrated capabilities that had no place in the quiet world she had built in Riverside. "The biological weapons are enough to devastate 6 major cities," Morrison pressed, recognizing that pure patriotic duty wasn't sufficient motivation for someone who had already sacrificed everything for her country. "Millions of innocent lives depend on stopping this transaction. Children, families, people just like the patrons you help every day in this library." The manipulation was expertly crafted, designed to exploit Victoria's genuine compassion for innocent people while bypassing her resistance to Shadow Division reactivation. Morrison understood that Victoria Summers cared deeply about protecting others, even if Vivian Cross had grown tired of the endless cycle of violence and counter-violence that defined covert operations. Victoria felt the weight of Elena's dying words pressing against her consciousness. Don't let them convince you that the work is more important than your life. But Elena had never faced a situation where refusing the work meant allowing millions of innocent people to die from biological warfare. The moral calculus that had seemed so clear 8 years ago suddenly became infinitely more complex. "You have 2 hours to decide," Morrison said, checking his tactical watch with the precision of someone operating under mission timeline constraints. "Our transport leaves Riverside at noon. If you're not on it, we proceed with alternative options that have significantly lower probability of success and much higher potential for civilian casualties." The ultimatum hung in the air like a loaded weapon. Morrison wasn't just asking Victoria to choose between her civilian life and Shadow Division service. He was forcing her to choose between personal peace and collective security, between Elena's wisdom and utilitarian necessity, between the woman she had become and the operative she had once been. Victoria looked around the library that had been her sanctuary for 8 years. Mrs. Patterson sat in her usual corner, reading the latest military memoir Victoria had selected for her. Teenage Jake Morrison worked on homework at a table near the computer terminals, occasionally glancing up for help with research techniques. A young mother guided her toddler through picture books, their quiet conversation punctuated by giggles and the rustle of turning pages. These people represented everything Victoria had chosen over her Shadow Division life: genuine human connections, simple daily interactions, the profound satisfaction of helping others without ulterior motives or hidden agendas. They were also precisely the kind of innocent civilians who would suffer if Petrov's biological weapons reached their intended targets. Morrison recognized the internal conflict playing out behind Victoria's carefully controlled expression. "Katerina Volkov was the perfect operative," he said, his voice softening slightly in recognition of the psychological pressure he was applying. "She could become anyone, convince anyone, eliminate any threat to mission success. But Katerina was also a performance, a role you played when circumstances required it. Victoria Summers is who you chose to become when you had the freedom to decide for yourself." The observation revealed Morrison's growing understanding of Victoria's psychological landscape. He wasn't trying to destroy Victoria Summers anymore. He was asking her to temporarily set aside her chosen identity in service of protecting millions of other people who deserve the same chance to choose their own lives. "This isn't about reactivating Vivian Cross permanently," Morrison continued, sensing Victoria's wavering resolve. "This is about asking Victoria Summers to make a choice that only someone with Vivian Cross's capabilities can make. One mission, 18 hours of your life, to prevent a catastrophe that would define the rest of human history." Victoria closed her eyes and felt Elena's presence in her memory, not the dying woman in the Sarajevo hospital, but the mentor who had taught her that true strength came from making impossible choices with grace and wisdom. Elena had never said the work wasn't important. She had warned against letting the work become more important than remembering why it mattered. When Victoria opened her eyes, Morrison saw something that made him step back involuntarily. The gentle librarian was still there, but underneath her surface calm was the predatory focus of someone who had once been the most dangerous operative in Shadow Division history. She was making the choice to protect innocent people, but she was making it as Victoria Summers, not as a reactivated asset following orders. "If I do this," Victoria said, her voice carrying new authority that made Morrison's team unconsciously shift to more alert postures, "I do it my way. No oversight, no real-time operational control, no extraction timeline that compromises mission effectiveness. You get me to Geneva, provide the identity documentation and equipment I specify, and then you wait for my signal." Morrison felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. He had successfully convinced Victoria to accept the mission, But he was beginning to understand that the woman who would infiltrate Petrov's organization wouldn't be the compliant operative shadow division protocols anticipated. She would be something far more dangerous, a legendary killer operating according to her own moral code rather than institutional authority. The quiet librarian had just agreed to become Katerina Volkov one final time, but she would be doing it to protect the life she had built as Victoria Summers, not to return to the life she had abandoned as Vivian Cross. Victoria had exactly 90 minutes between Morrison's ultimatum and their departure for Geneva. She spent the first 30 minutes closing the library with meticulous care, as if this ordinary Thursday routine might be the last normal thing she would ever do. She updated the computer system with weekend programming schedules, left detailed notes for Margaret Thornfield about patron special requests, and carefully shelved the books that had been returned that morning. Her hands moved through these familiar tasks while her mind underwent a transformation that would have terrified anyone who witnessed it. 8 years of carefully suppressed operational instincts began resurging with crystalline clarity. Muscle memory from thousands of hours of combat training reasserted itself. Tactical thinking patterns that she had deliberately buried started analyzing threats, calculating probabilities, and developing contingency plans for scenarios that Victoria Summers had never needed to consider. The walk home to Maple Street felt like crossing between parallel universes. With each step, Victoria consciously said goodbye to pieces of the life she had built. She memorized the way afternoon sunlight filtered through the maple trees lining her street, the sound of children playing in the Martinez family's backyard, the familiar creak of her front porch steps that she had always meant to fix, but somehow never found time for. Inside her house, Victoria moved with newfound purpose toward the spare bedroom she used as a home office, behind a false panel she had installed during her first month in Riverside was a climate-controlled safe containing everything Vivian Cross might need if Victoria Summers's cover was ever compromised. She had hoped never to open it again, but Elena's training had been too thorough to ignore the necessity of maintaining emergency resources. The safe contained multiple passports in various identities, each with complete supporting documentation dating back years. Cash in 6 different currencies totaling nearly $200,000. Encrypted communication devices that could contact secure networks she wasn't supposed to remember how to access. And beneath everything else, wrapped in silk that still carried the faint scent of her old perfume, was the complete Katerina Volkov identity kit. Victoria's hands trembled slightly as she unwrapped the materials. The passport photo showed a woman who looked similar to Victoria Summers, but carried herself with entirely different energy. Sophisticated, dangerous, aristocratic. Katerina's wardrobe had been selected to project wealth, intelligence, and just enough moral flexibility to attract men like Dmitry Kozlovsky. The jewelry was real, the designer clothing perfectly tailored, and every accessory chosen to reinforce the image of a woman comfortable operating in the shadowy margins of international arms dealing. But the most crucial element of the Katerina Volkov identity wasn't contained in any physical object. It was the psychological transformation required to become someone capable of the moral compromises that the cover demanded. Katerina had to be genuinely attracted to dangerous men, authentically comfortable with violence, and convincingly indifferent to the suffering that weapons trafficking caused around the world. Victoria sat on her bed surrounded by the artifacts of her former life and felt Elena's presence more strongly than she had since those final moments in the Sarajevo hospital. The hardest part, Elena had once told her, isn't learning to become someone else. It's remembering who you really are underneath all the performances. The transformation began with physical preparation. Victoria stripped away the gentle librarian's aesthetic with systematic precision. Off came the reading glasses, the soft cardigan, the comfortable flats that had carried her through thousands of peaceful days. She showered with expensive French soap, that would leave the right scent signature. Then began the careful process of applying makeup that would subtly reshape her facial structure and project an entirely different personality. Katerina's wardrobe demanded a different relationship with her own body. Where Victoria dressed for comfort and professional appropriateness, Katerina dressed to be noticed, to project confidence, to suggest both intellectual sophistication and physical availability. The silk blouse cut low enough to distract male attention, the tailored skirt that suggested wealth and taste, the designer heels that added 3 inches of height and changed her entire posture and movement patterns. But the deepest transformation was psychological. Victoria stood before her bedroom mirror and consciously began dismantling the emotional barriers she had spent 8 years constructing. The compassion that made her perfect for library work became a calculated tool for manipulation. The patience that helped struggling readers became the strategic stillness of a predator waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The gentle humor that endeared her to book club members became the sophisticated wit that would charm and distract her targets. She practiced Katerina's voice lower, more accented, carrying hints of Eastern European aristocracy and Western education. She rehearsed Katerina's laugh, her walk, her way of smoking cigarettes as both prop and weapon. She accessed memories of chemistry knowledge that Victoria Summers had no reason to possess, technical expertise in explosives and chemical weapons that only someone with Katerina's background would naturally discuss, the mental preparation required. Confronting aspects of herself that Victoria had successfully suppressed for 8 years. Katerina needed to be capable of killing without hesitation, of lying with perfect conviction, of using sexual attraction as a weapon against men who trusted her. These capabilities existed within Victoria's psychological architecture, but accessing them meant temporarily setting aside every moral principle that defined her civilian identity. Morrison arrived precisely at the scheduled time to find a woman who bore only superficial resemblance to the librarian he had been pressuring for weeks. Katerina Volkov stood in Victoria's living room like a character from an expensive thriller, beautiful, dangerous, and carrying herself with the unconscious authority of someone accustomed to operating in environments where mistakes meant death. "Dr. Cross," Morrison began, but Katerina interrupted him with a gesture that conveyed both impatience and command. "Katerina," she corrected, her voice carrying the precise accent that Petrov would remember from her interactions with Kozlovsky. "If we're doing this, we're doing it completely. From this moment until the mission concludes, Dr. Cross and Victoria Summers don't exist. There's only Katerina Volkov, and Katerina has very specific requirements for how this operation will proceed." Morrison felt a chill of recognition as he observed the transformation. The psychological profiles had described Vivian Cross's ability to completely inhabit cover identities, but witnessing it firsthand was profoundly unsettling. The woman before him wasn't Victoria pretending to be Katerina she had somehow become. Katerina at a fundamental level, complete with different body language, vocal patterns, and even facial expressions. "I'll need complete operational autonomy once we reach Geneva," Katerina continued, her tone suggesting she was dictating terms rather than negotiating them. "Petrov is paranoid and sophisticated. Any sign of oversight or external control will compromise the mission before we make contact. I approach him alone. I assess the situation according to my judgment, and I decide how to proceed based on real-time intelligence rather than predetermined protocols." Morrison nodded, recognizing that he was no longer dealing with someone he could pressure or manipulate. Katerina Volkov was a force of nature, a weapon that Victoria Summers had chosen to unleash for 18 hours in service of protecting innocent lives. The most disturbing aspect was how natural the transformation appeared, as if Katerina had always existed beneath Victoria's surface, waiting for circumstances that would justify her resurrection. As they prepared to leave for the airport, Katerina moved through Victoria's house one final time, touching familiar objects with the detached attention of someone saying goodbye to a previous life. She paused at the kitchen table where she had shared countless quiet breakfasts, the reading chair where she had discovered dozens of novels, the window that looked out onto the garden she had tended with genuine joy. "This is temporary," Morrison said, recognizing the weight of what he was asking her to sacrifice. 18 hours, and then you can come back to all of this." Katerina turned to look at him with eyes that held knowledge Morrison couldn't fully comprehend. "Some transformations can't be undone," she said quietly. "Some choices change you in ways that last longer than the circumstances that required them. Katerina Volkov is capable of things that Victoria Summers could never live with remembering." As they walked toward Morrison's waiting vehicle, Katerina felt the last connections to her civilian identity stretching and beginning to break. She was committed now to becoming the woman who could infiltrate Petrov's operation, gain his trust, and eliminate a threat that could kill millions of innocent people. But she also understood that resurrection came with a price, and that some aspects of Katerina Volkov might prove impossible to bury again once the mission was complete. The Hotel Beau Rivage in Geneva buzzed with the kind of understated elegance that provided perfect cover for illegal transactions worth hundreds of millions of dollars. Dr. Alexei Petrov had chosen the venue specifically for its reputation as a neutral meeting ground where international businessmen conducted sensitive negotiations without unwanted scrutiny. The hotel's management had long ago perfected the art of selective blindness. When it came to their more exclusive clientele, Katerina Volkov entered the hotel's bar at precisely 9:30 p.m., her timing calculated to suggest both confidence and careful planning. She had spent the afternoon establishing her presence in Geneva, visiting locations that Petrov's surveillance would notice, creating the digital footprint of someone who had legitimate business in the city beyond their scheduled meeting. Her performance had to be flawless from the moment she stepped off the plane until Petrov was convinced she was exactly who she claimed to be. Petrov sat alone at a corner table, his pale eyes constantly scanning the room for threats while his hands nervously adjusted his expensive watch-a-tel that revealed his underlying anxiety despite his outward calm. At 62, he carried himself with the careful dignity of someone who had survived 3 decades in the international arms trade by never fully trusting anyone, never becoming comfortable with success, never forgetting that today's ally could become tomorrow's assassin. The moment Petrov saw Katerina, his entire demeanor shifted. Recognition, curiosity, and carefully suppressed excitement played across his features as he processed the impossible appearance of a woman he had believed dead for 8 years. Katerina moved through the bar with predatory grace, acknowledging his presence with the slightest nod before settling at the bar itself, ordering vodka neat and lighting a cigarette with movements that projected both sophistication and barely contained danger. The psychological game began immediately. Petrov wanted to approach her, but Katerina's body language suggested someone who might disappear at the first sign of unwanted attention. She had positioned herself where he could observe her while maintaining multiple escape routes, creating the impression of someone deeply paranoid but professionally competent. Every gesture reinforced the narrative that she was Katerina Volkov, chemist, arms dealer, and survivor of the Montenegro explosion that had killed Dmitry Kozlovsky. After 20 minutes of careful observation, Petrov finally approached. "Excuse me," he said in accented English, his voice carrying just the right mixture of curiosity and caution. "You remind me of someone I knew years ago. Someone I thought had died in a very unfortunate incident." Katerina turned slowly, her expression cycling through recognition, wariness, and calculated assessment. When she spoke, her voice carried the precise accent and inflection that Petrov would remember from her conversations with Kozlovsky 8 years earlier. "Alexei," she said, allowing surprise and pleasure to color her tone. "I wondered if I might encounter familiar faces in Geneva." Though I must say, you look considerably more prosperous than when we last met." The conversation that followed was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation. Katerina wove together truth and fiction with such skill that even someone as paranoid as Petra found himself drawn into her narrative. She claimed to have survived the Montenegro explosion by leaving Kozlovsky's compound hours before the attack, warned by intelligence sources who had detected the impending raid. She had spent 8 years in hiding, she explained, moving through Eastern Europe under various identities while slowly rebuilding her reputation and resources. Dmitri's death was educational, Katerina said, her voice carrying just the right note of cold calculation. It demonstrated the importance of maintaining operational security and never becoming too comfortable with any single identity or location. "I've learned to be more careful about my associations and more selective about my business partnerships." Petrov listened with growing fascination as Katerina described her theoretical work in weaponized biological agents, technical knowledge that no civilian could possibly possess. She discussed molecular structures, delivery mechanisms, and chemical stabilization techniques with the casual expertise of someone who had devoted years to understanding how to kill people efficiently on a massive scale. But the crucial moment came when Petrov, still not entirely convinced of her identity, decided to test her knowledge of information that only the real Katerina Volkov could know. He asked about specific details from her relationship with Kozlovsky, private conversations, personal preferences, intimate details that would have been impossible for an imposter to discover through intelligence gathering. Katerina's responses were flawless. She recalled Kozlovsky's habit of collecting rare wines that he never actually drank, his obsession with Serbian folk music that he played during business meetings, his peculiar superstition about conducting negotiations only on days when the temperature was above 20 degrees Celsius. She remembered the scar on his left shoulder from a knife fight in Belgrade, the way he always wore the same silver ring during important transactions, his custom of testing new weapons personally before offering them to clients. More importantly, she demonstrated intimate knowledge of Kozlovsky's business operations, the names of his primary suppliers, the locations of weapons caches that had never been discovered by law enforcement, the coded communication methods he used to coordinate with terrorist organizations across 3 continents. Information that Katerina Volkov would have learned during their intimate relationship, but that no intelligence agency had ever fully documented. Petrov's suspicions evaporated as Katerina proved her identity beyond any possible doubt. But the real triumph came when she began discussing her current situation with the perfect mixture of vulnerability and strength that would make her irresistible to someone like Petrov. She explained that 8 years in hiding had left her financially comfortable, but professionally isolated, that she was seeking to re-establish herself in the international arms trade but needed the right partnership to provide both resources and protection. "I have theoretical knowledge that could revolutionize biological weapons delivery systems," Katerina said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "But theory without application is worthless. I need access to practical resources, laboratory facilities, and distribution networks that can turn concepts into reality." The hook was perfectly baited. Petrov saw an opportunity to acquire not just Katerina's expertise, but her complete loyalty through financial dependence and shared criminal exposure. He began describing his current operation with the enthusiasm of someone who had been seeking exactly the partner that Katerina appeared to represent. The biological weapons transaction, he explained, was merely the first phase of a larger operation. The anthrax would be used to demonstrate the effectiveness of his distribution network to potential clients, after which he planned to expand into more sophisticated biological agents that required advanced chemistry knowledge to produce safely. Katerina's expertise would be invaluable for developing next-generation weapons that could bypass existing detection systems and countermeasures. As Petrov talked, Katerina mentally cataloged every detail, the location of the weapons laboratory. In an abandoned pharmaceutical facility outside Zurich, the names of his primary clients in 3 different terrorist organizations, the timeline for upcoming transactions that would put biological weapons in the hands of groups planning attacks across Europe and North America. She memorized security protocols, personnel information, and financial arrangements with the photographic precision that had made Vivian Cross legendary within Shadow Division circles. But the most crucial intelligence came when Petrov, growing increasingly comfortable with Katerina's presence, revealed the scope of his ultimate ambitions. The current biological weapons were merely prototypes for a much larger operation involving weaponized smallpox that could devastate entire continents. He possessed samples of viral material that most experts believed had been completely eradicated, along with the technical knowledge to modify the virus for increased lethality and resistance to existing vaccines. Katerina felt the full weight of Morrison's ultimatum crystallize into deadly clarity. This wasn't just about preventing one terrorist attack. It was about stopping a biological warfare program that could kill hundreds of millions of people across multiple continents. The stakes were even higher than Shadow Division intelligence had indicated, and the window for intervention was rapidly closing. The evening concluded with Petrov inviting Katerina to visit his laboratory facility the following morning, where she could examine his current biological weapons inventory and discuss potential collaboration on future projects. He was so convinced of her authenticity and so excited by the prospect of their partnership that he offered information about security protocols, personnel schedules, and laboratory access procedures that would make the next phase of her mission significantly easier to execute. As they parted outside the hotel, Petrov kissed Katerina's hand with old-world courtesy while secretly planning how to gradually increase her dependence on his organization until she became a permanent and completely controlled asset. Katerina accepted his attention with the perfect combination of appreciation and independence that would keep him interested while preventing him from becoming overly possessive or suspicious. Walking back to her hotel, through Geneva's elegant streets, Katerina felt the weight of what she had learned pressing against her consciousness. She had successfully infiltrated Petrov's operation and acquired intelligence that would allow Shadow Division strike teams to eliminate the biological weapons threat completely. But she had also discovered that the threat was far larger and more immediate than anyone had realized. Within 18 hours, Katerina Volkov had proven that 8 years of civilian life hadn't diminished her capabilities as an operative. She had demonstrated that the skills, instincts, and psychological flexibility that had made Vivian Cross legendary were still perfectly intact beneath Victoria Summers's gentle exterior. But she had also discovered that some knowledge, once acquired, becomes impossible to forget, and that some choices, once made, change you in ways that extend far beyond the immediate circumstances that required them. The laboratory facility outside Zurich fell at precisely 4:17 a.m., 3 hours before Katerina was scheduled to meet Petrov for their morning tour. Morrison's strike team moved through the converted pharmaceutical complex with clinical efficiency, neutralizing security personnel and securing biological weapon samples, while Katerina provided real-time intelligence from her position at a cafe 2 kilometers away. The operation was flawless in its execution. Anya Kozlov eliminated 3 perimeter guards with silent precision, her sniper rifle equipped with subsonic ammunition that left no acoustic signature. David Kim disabled security systems and communication networks, ensuring that no warning could reach Petrov or his international clients. Miguel Santos led the assault team through the laboratory complex, his urban warfare expertise proving invaluable in navigating the facility's converted industrial architecture. But the true scope of what they discovered exceeded even Katerina's intelligence estimates. Petrov's laboratory contained enough weaponized biological agents to devastate 12 major cities simultaneously, along with detailed distribution plans that would have coordinated attacks across 3 continents within a 72-hour window. The threat was orders of magnitude larger than Shadow Division's most pessimistic projections had suggested. Morrison's voice crackled through Katerina's encrypted earpiece as he surveyed the laboratory's contents. "Jesus Christ," he whispered, his professional composure cracking as he processed the scale of the prevented catastrophe. "There are enough biological weapons here to kill half the population of Europe. The delivery mechanisms are more sophisticated than anything in our classified databases." Katerina felt a complex mixture of professional satisfaction and existential horror as she absorbed the implications of Morrison's report. Her infiltration had prevented what would have been the most devastating biological warfare attack in human history, but the knowledge of how close the world had come to such catastrophe was almost unbearable. Millions of people would wake up tomorrow morning never knowing that their continued existence had depended on 18 hours of work by operatives, whose names they would never learn. The capture of Petrov himself proved almost anticlimactic after the dramatic success of the laboratory raid. When he arrived at the cafe for his scheduled meeting with Katerina, he walked directly into a Shadow Division extraction team, disguised as Swiss Federal Police, conducting a routine immigration check. His expression of confusion transformed into terror as he recognized Morrison's tactical gear and realized that his entire operation had been compromised. Petrov's interrogation began immediately in a secure facility that didn't officially exist on any Swiss government maps. Within 6 hours, enhanced interrogation techniques had extracted the names of 17 terrorist organizations, 43 planned attack sites, and the locations of 6 additional biological weapons caches across Eastern Europe and the Middle East. The intelligence windfall would keep counter-terrorism agencies busy for months, rolling up networks that had been developing for years. But for Katerina, watching Petrov's arrest from across the street, the mission's success felt hollowed out by the personal cost of achieving it. She had proven that Vivian Cross's capabilities remained intact after 8 years of civilian life, but in doing so, she had also demonstrated that Victoria Summers's gentle existence had been built on a foundation of willful amnesia about her true nature. Morrison found her 3 hours later in her hotel room, methodically packing Katerina Volkov's wardrobe with the same precision she had used to assemble the identity 18 hours earlier. But instead of transformation back to Victoria Summers, Katerina seemed to be systematically dismantling herself, folding away pieces of an identity that had served its purpose and would never be needed again. The mission was a complete success, Morrison reported, his voice carrying genuine admiration for what she had accomplished. Petrov's entire network is being rolled up as we speak. Conservative estimates suggest we prevented attacks that would have killed between 8 and 12 million people across multiple continents. Katerina nodded without looking up from her packing. And the biological weapons samples? Secured and being transferred to appropriate disposal facilities. The laboratory has been sanitized, and cover stories are being distributed to explain the facility's destruction as an industrial accident. Petrov will disappear into a black site, where very specialized people will ensure he provides every detail. About his international connections, Morrison studied Katerina's demeanor with growing concern. He had expected relief, satisfaction, or at least acknowledgement of the mission's unprecedented success. Instead, he observed someone who appeared to be methodically erasing her own existence, preparing for a transition that he couldn't quite identify. "The transport back to Riverside is waiting," Morrison said carefully. "You can be home by tomorrow evening, back to your library and your normal life." This operation never happened, as far as official records are concerned. Katerina finally looked up from her packing, and Morrison felt a chill at the expression in her eyes. The gentle librarian was completely gone, but Katerina Volkov had also disappeared. What remained was something else entirely, someone who had looked into an abyss of human evil and emerged fundamentally changed by the experience. "Do you really believe that?" Katerina asked, her voice carrying a weariness that Morrison had never heard from any operative, regardless of their years of service. "Do you think someone can witness what we discovered in that laboratory, prevent that level of human catastrophe, and then simply return to checking out romance novels and helping children with their homework?" Morrison found himself without an adequate response. Shadow Division's psychological protocols assumed that operatives compartmentalize their experiences, that they could transition between civilian and professional identities without permanent psychological damage. But Katerina's question forced him to confront the possibility that some missions changed people in ways that couldn't be undone through standard debriefing procedures. Victoria Summers was possible, Katerina continued, because she could believe that the world was fundamentally safe, that evil existed but was manageable, that ordinary people could live ordinary lives without constantly confronting the reality of how close we all are to complete catastrophe. But Katerina Volkov knows better. She knows that people like Petrov are developing weapons that could end civilization, and that only people like us stand between innocent civilians and unimaginable horror. The implications of her words settled between them with the weight of an ultimatum. Morrison realized that his successful mission had created an unexpected consequence. Instead of returning a dormant asset to civilian life, he had awakened someone who could no longer ignore her unique capabilities and the world's desperate need for those skills. "What are you saying?" Morrison asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "I'm saying that Victoria Summers was a beautiful dream," Katerina replied. "But dreams end when you wake up to reality. The question isn't whether I can go back to Riverside, it's whether I have the right to pretend that this work isn't necessary, when I know exactly how necessary it is." Morrison felt a mixture of triumph and profound unease as he processed her words. Shadow Division had successfully reactivated their most legendary operative, but not through the institutional pressure he had planned to apply. Instead, Katerina had chosen to remain active because her civilian experience had given her a deeper understanding of what was worth protecting, and a more personal investment in ensuring that protection continued. "There are other threats," Morrison said carefully, recognizing that he was negotiating with someone who now held all the leverage in their relationship. "Other situations that require your specific capabilities. But the terms would be different this time." Katerina smiled with an expression that combined Vivian Cross's tactical brilliance with Victoria Summers' hard-won wisdom. "Yes," she agreed. "They would be very different. Because this time, I'm not choosing duty over personal happiness. I'm choosing to protect the possibility of personal happiness for everyone else." The transformation was complete, but not in the way Morrison had anticipated. He had expected to reactivate Vivian Cross and deploy her according to Shadow Division priorities. Instead, he found himself partnering with someone who had transcended both her civilian and operative identities, someone who would work with Shadow Division but never again work for them. As they prepared to leave Geneva, Morrison realized that Katerina represented something unprecedented in Shadow Division history, an operative who had chosen their mission not from institutional loyalty or patriotic duty, but from personal understanding of what the work actually meant for the people it protected. She would be more effective than ever, but also more dangerous to anyone who tried to treat her as a controllable asset rather than an autonomous agent of protection. The quiet librarian who had hidden in Riverside for 8 years was gone forever. In her place stood someone who understood both the cost of violence and the price of peace, someone who could kill when necessary but would never again lose sight of why such killing might be required. 6 months later, the Riverside Public Library looked exactly the same from the outside. The same weathered brick facade, the same hand-painted sign announcing story time on Tuesday afternoons, The same maple trees lining the sidewalk where Victoria Summers had once walked to work, every morning with the peaceful certainty of someone living an ordinary life, but the woman who now unlocked those heavy oak doors at 7:45 a.m. was neither Victoria Summers nor Katerina Volkov. She was someone entirely new, someone who had integrated the compassion of a small-town librarian with the lethal capabilities of a legendary operative, someone who understood that the most profound service to humanity sometimes required the willingness to become temporarily inhuman. Margaret Thornfield had noticed the changes immediately upon her colleague's return from what had been described as a family emergency in Europe. The gentle librarian was still there, still patient with difficult patrons, still brilliant at recommending exactly the right book, still beloved by the children who attended story time. But there was something different in her eyes now, a depth of knowledge that seemed almost burdened to carry, an awareness of shadows that most people never suspected existed. "She seems older somehow," Margaret confided to Rebecca Park during one of their coffee breaks. "Not physically, but like she's seen things that changed her perspective on everything. She still loves the work, but she does it with a kind of intensity that wasn't there before." What Margaret couldn't know was that the woman she called Victoria had spent the previous 6 months operating under deep cover across 3 continents, dismantling terrorist networks that most intelligence agencies didn't even know existed. Working in partnership with Morrison's Shadow Division team, she had prevented 4 separate biological weapons attacks, eliminated 2 arms dealers whose client lists read like a roster of international terrorism, and extracted intelligence that had saved thousands of lives across Europe, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia. But unlike her previous incarnation as Vivian Cross, this new operative had never lost sight of why the work mattered. Every mission was completed with surgical precision designed to minimize collateral damage. Every operation was planned to protect innocent civilians rather than simply achieve tactical objectives. She brought Victoria Summers' moral compass to Vivian Cross's skill set, creating something unprecedented in the covert operations world. Morrison had initially struggled to adapt to their new working relationship. He was accustomed to operatives who followed orders, accepted mission parameters, and executed plans developed by command structure analysts who never left their secured facilities. But his partner now insisted on operational autonomy, demanded detailed intelligence about civilian populations in target areas, and frequently modified mission objectives to account for humanitarian concerns that traditional protocols ignored. Results, however, were undeniable. Their success rate was unprecedented. Their intelligence gathering was more sophisticated than anything Shadow Division had previously achieved, and their operations consistently produced strategic advantages that extended far beyond immediate tactical goals. Other Shadow Division commanders began requesting her involvement in their most sensitive missions, though few understood the philosophical transformation that made her so effective. The integration of her dual existence had required careful balance. 3 weeks of every month, she was Victoria Summers helping patrons, organizing community programs, maintaining the relationships that kept her connected to the humanity she was protecting. 1 week per month, she was something else entirely, operating in environments where moral compromises were necessary, but never losing sight of the moral principles that made those compromises worthwhile. Her book club friends noticed that she had developed new interests: international relations, conflict resolution, Middle Eastern history, but attributed this to natural intellectual curiosity rather than professional necessity. Sarah Wellington occasionally commented that Victoria seemed to have gained unusual insight into human psychology, an ability to read people's motivations and emotional states with almost supernatural accuracy. "It's like she can see right through people's facades," Sarah had told the other book club members. "Not in a judgmental way, but with this deep understanding of what drives them, what they're afraid of, what they're really trying to accomplish underneath all their surface behaviors." The library itself had become something of a sanctuary, a place where the woman who could kill 17 people in 4 minutes came to remember why such killing might sometimes be necessary. Watching children discover their love of reading, helping elderly patrons stay connected with their families through technology, providing resources for students struggling with research projects, these simple human interactions served as constant reminders of what normal life looked like, what civilization was supposed to protect. But the most profound change was in her relationship with Elena's memory. The promise she had made in that Sarajevo hospital to choose personal happiness over professional duty had evolved into something more complex and ultimately more sustainable. She had learned that personal happiness couldn't exist in isolation from collective security, that her individual peace was meaningless if it was built on willful ignorance of others' suffering. Elena's cabin in northern Canada had become her planning retreat, the place where she prepared for missions and debriefed after operations. She had added Elena's photograph to the mantle, along with pictures of library patrons, book club friends, and the children who attended her story times. The collection served as a visual reminder of everyone whose continued existence depended on people like her being willing to do work that most people couldn't even imagine. Morrison visited the library occasionally, maintaining the cover story that he was still investigating federal grant compliance. But their real communication happened through encrypted channels that allowed for mission planning and intelligence sharing without compromising her civilian identity. He had come to respect her insistence on maintaining both aspects of her existence, recognizing that her civilian connections made her more effective as an operative rather than less. The broader Shadow Division community remained divided about her unorthodox approach. Traditionalists argued that operatives couldn't maintain emotional attachments without compromising operational effectiveness. But results-oriented commanders increasingly requested her involvement in missions that required cultural sensitivity, psychological sophistication, or long-term strategic thinking that went beyond immediate tactical objectives. What none of them fully understood was that she had solved the central paradox of covert operations: how to maintain your humanity while doing work that required you to temporarily set aside human moral constraints. The answer, she had discovered, was to never lose sight of what humanity actually meant, to remember that the purpose of necessary violence was always to protect unnecessary violence from becoming normalized. Her story had become legend within certain circles. The librarian who had prevented biological warfare attacks while never missing a story time. The operative who could eliminate international threats while maintaining perfect cover as a small-town intellectual. But the most important aspect of her transformation was something that couldn't be captured in mission reports or operational assessments. She had become living proof that you could choose to serve something larger than yourself without sacrificing everything that made you yourself. That duty and personal fulfillment weren't necessarily opposing forces. That the most effective protectors were often those who understood exactly what they were protecting, because they had experienced it personally. Today, as you go about your daily life, whether you're in downtown Portland or rural Nebraska, whether you're heading to work or school, or simply running errands, remember that you're surrounded by hidden stories. The person checking you out at the grocery store might be a former surgeon who chose a simpler life after saving thousands of patients. The quiet man who teaches your child's math class might have once coordinated humanitarian missions in war zones. The woman who helps you find books at your local library might have spent last month preventing terrorist attacks that would have devastated entire cities. These hidden guardians walk among us, choosing to protect the very normalcy that allows the rest of us to live without constant awareness of how fragile our peaceful existence really is. They understand that the highest form of service isn't recognition or praise. It's the preservation of a world where children can discover their love of reading, where elderly people can share stories with young librarians, where ordinary Tuesday afternoons can unfold without catastrophe. The next time you visit your local library, Look closely at the person helping you find information or recommending your next great read. You might be encountering someone whose real story would change everything you thought you knew about heroism, sacrifice, and the hidden price of the peaceful life you're living. If you were faced with the choice between personal peace and protecting others' right to that same peace, what would you choose? Could you be both the gentle person your community sees and the guardian they never know they need? The answer might matter more than you think, because in a world where threats evolve constantly and evil adapts endlessly, our greatest protection often comes from the quiet heroes who refuse to choose between being human and being effective. Where are you watching this from today? Drop a comment below and let us know. We love hearing from viewers who understand that the most extraordinary people are often hiding in the most ordinary places, protecting the beautiful, simple life that makes Tuesday afternoon story times possible. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.